I'm Marcus Volkov, and I've been driving trucks for 32 years. Most people think trucking is boring. Long stretches of highway, monotonous driving, coffee stops at 3 in the morning, but I learned early on that the roads have their own rules, their own secrets, the kind of secrets that stay with you forever. What happened to me on a November night in 1998 changed everything I thought I knew about driving alone at night. I was hauling electronics from Chicago to Denver, running the I-80 corridor through Nebraska. The weather had turned cold and bitter. Snow was coming down in sheets, the kind where visibility drops to maybe 50 feet in front of you. Most sensible drivers had pulled over at truck stops to wait it out. But I was behind schedule and stubborn, a dangerous combination. It was 2:45 in the morning when I saw her on the side of the road near mile marker 187. A woman in a light blue dress standing in a blizzard. No coat, no shoes, just standing there with her thumb out like it was a warm summer day. Every bone in my body told me to keep driving. Something about her wasn't right. But I'd been raised by my mother, Elena, to never abandon someone in need. So I pulled over. The moment I stopped, I knew I'd made a mistake. She walked toward my cab with this strange, fluid motion, like she was gliding across the snow. When she climbed up into the passenger seat, I noticed her skin was ice cold. Her eyes were completely black, not the pupil and iris. The entire eye was black, like looking into empty space. She told me her name was Petra, said she needed to get to mile marker 212. That's where she died, she whispered. That's where he left me. I should have kicked her out immediately. Instead, I drove. For the next hour, I drove with a ghost sitting beside me, and I didn't even realize it until we reached that marker and she simply faded away. The moment Petra disappeared, my CB radio came alive with static. Not normal static. This was different, layered, like multiple voices trying to speak at once but all getting tangled together. Then I heard him. A man's voice, calm and measured, coming through my radio asking for my location. I told him where I was. He said, "We know. We've been following you." I tried to switch channels. Nothing. Every single frequency was filled with that same layered static. I tried turning the radio off. It turned back on by itself. That's when the voice told me something that made my blood freeze. He said, "You picked up Petra. You let her in your cab. Now you need to understand what that means." The voice belonged to a man named Victor. He explained that he'd been a trucker like me. 40 years ago, he'd picked up a hitchhiker who looked exactly like Petra. She'd seemed real until mile marker 212. That's where she'd revealed the truth. She wasn't human. She was something else, something that fed on the kindness of drivers, something that had been hitchhiking along that same stretch of highway for decades, picking off truckers one by one. Victor said he'd managed to escape, but barely. He'd crashed his truck trying to get away from her, survived the crash, but spent the next 40 years tracking her movements, trying to warn other drivers. The voice crackled and he said, "She's marked you now. She'll come back, and next time you won't be able to make her disappear so easily." I drove the rest of the way to Denver in absolute terror. Every shadow on the road looked like her. Every reflection in my mirror seemed to show her sitting behind me. When I finally arrived at the distribution center in Denver, I sat in my truck for 2 hours trying to convince myself it was all some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But I knew better. I'd felt her cold skin. I'd seen those black eyes. After Denver, I tried to go back to normal life. Picked up new loads, ran different routes, tried to convince myself that what happened was just a strange dream or maybe some kind of psychological episode. But 3 weeks later, I got a call from my dispatcher, Stefan. He had a special job for me. High-paying, confidential delivery to a warehouse outside of Salt Lake City. The address he gave me didn't match any warehouse I could find on my GPS. When I plugged it in, the device just spun uselessly. Stefan insisted the coordinates were correct. Said the place was owned by a private company that valued discretion. The money was too good to turn down. I was still paying off my divorce settlement and my truck needed repairs. So I drove to Salt Lake City and then followed the coordinates Stefan had given me. They led me into the desert, away from any major roads. For 30 miles, I drove through nothing but scrubland and rock formations. I was convinced I'd driven into some kind of trap. But then I saw it, a massive warehouse rising up out of the desert like it had been there forever. Except it hadn't been there forever. I'd driven through this area 100 times in my career. I would have remembered a structure this large. It was steel gray, maybe 5 stories tall, with no windows and no visible doors or loading bays. Just a flat expanse of metal rising out of the sand. My truck's engine started making a sound it had never made before, like it was struggling to operate. When I parked and climbed down from the cab, I felt it immediately. A cold spot in the middle of the desert. The air was at least 20 degrees colder than it had been 30 seconds before. The warehouse seemed to be absorbing heat from the surrounding air. I walked toward where a door should have been, and it simply appeared. like it was manifesting in front of me. Inside was darkness so complete it seemed to have texture. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my truck and drive away as fast as I could, but I was transfixed. Compelled. My feet carried me forward into that darkness like they had their own will. Inside, my eyes gradually adjusted, and I could make out the shape of the warehouse interior. It was massive. The ceiling disappeared into shadow 30 stories above me, and it was full of trucks, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all different makes and models from different eras. Some looked modern, others looked like they were from the 1950s. They were arranged in perfect rows, all facing the same direction, all parked at exactly the same angle. There was no dust on them, no decay, like they'd been placed there moments ago. As I walked deeper into the warehouse, I realized something horrifying. There were bodies in some of the cabs, skeletal remains of men still gripping steering wheels. Some of them had been there so long they were barely more than dust. Others looked fresher, still wearing the clothes they died in. I found myself walking toward one of these trucks almost against my will. I looked in the window and saw a skeleton in a trucker's cap, a wedding ring still on the finger bone gripping the wheel. The skeleton turned its head and looked at me. I ran. I don't remember running, but suddenly I was sprinting back toward where I'd entered the warehouse. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of engines starting. One by one, all those trucks were coming to life. The air filled with the sound of diesel engines roaring and grinding. I burst through the door and found myself in the desert again. My truck was still there, but the key wouldn't turn in the ignition. The warehouse door was opening wider. Something was coming out. Something that looked like a truck but wasn't quite right. The dimensions were slightly wrong. The color was too dark. It rolled toward me slowly, inexorably, like it had all the time in the world. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. But somehow I got that key to turn and the engine fired to life. I slammed the truck into gear and hit the accelerator. The thing that had emerged from the warehouse seemed to accelerate toward me in response. But I had a head start. I'd been driving trucks for 3 decades. I knew how to handle a rig under pressure. I raced back through the desert following the tire tracks I'd made on the way in. Behind me, I could see the malformed truck matching my speed. It never got closer, but it never fell behind either. It was just there, a presence in my mirrors, a reminder that I wasn't going to escape this. I drove for what felt like hours until I finally saw civilization again. Buildings, power lines, traffic on the main highway. The moment I merged onto the I-15, the thing behind me simply stopped. It pulled over on the side of the desert road and just sat there watching me drive away. I kept checking my mirrors for the next 100 miles, terrified it would start moving again. When I finally made it to the truck stop, I pulled in and just sat in the cab for a long time. I looked at the delivery papers Stefan had given me. They were blank, completely blank. The address, the warehouse, the cargo description, all of it had vanished. I called Stefan and he had no memory of giving me that job. When I described what happened, he said I must be confused, that I'd never received a call from him that day. But I knew the truth. I'd been to that place. I'd seen those trucks and those skeletal remains. And somewhere in the desert outside Salt Lake City, that warehouse was still there, still collecting trucks, still waiting for the next driver foolish enough to follow its coordinates into the wasteland. After Salt Lake City, I needed time to process what had happened. I couldn't go home. The thought of sitting alone in my apartment terrified me, so I kept driving. Just endless miles on the highway with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of the engine. I pulled into a small diner outside of Laramie, Wyoming around 6 in the evening. A place called Rosie's that had been there since probably the 1960s. The waitress was a woman named Ingrid. She had red hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She poured my coffee without asking and said, "You look like someone who's seen something they shouldn't have." I told her I didn't know what she meant. She smiled and said, "Yes, you do, and you're not the first." That's when Ingrid told me about the other truckers. There had been 17 of them over the past 5 years who'd come into her diner looking exactly like I looked. Terrified, haunted, desperate. All of them had the same story. All of them had been to places that shouldn't exist. All of them had encountered things that defied rational explanation. She told me about a man named Roman who'd picked up a hitchhiker near Cheyenne. The hitchhiker had looked perfectly normal until they reached a certain mile marker. Then the passenger had simply melted like wax, leaving only a puddle of something that smelled like burned plastic and decay. Roman had driven his truck into a ditch trying to escape. She told me about Klaus, who'd been delivering cargo to a warehouse that existed in a pocket of space that was somehow outside normal reality. He'd gone inside and lost 3 days. When he came back out, only 6 hours had passed. He'd aged visibly. His hair had gone gray at the temples. Ingrid said all of these men had one thing in common. They'd all picked up hitchhikers or followed false coordinates because they were being pulled toward something, like they were being hunted. Before I left the diner, Ingrid gave me a piece of paper. On it were 17 names and dates, all men who'd experienced similar phenomena, all truckers. Some of them I recognized from industry newsletters. A few had been reported missing. Others had simply disappeared from the trucking community, their families receiving no explanation. At the bottom of the list was my name, Marcus Volkov, and next to it, today's date. Ingrid said she'd added me as soon as I walked through the door. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. It was like she could sense when someone had crossed over into the places between, the spaces where the normal rules didn't apply. I asked her what was happening. Why were truckers being targeted? Was it something specific about trucks? About the highways? Ingrid said she didn't have all the answers, but she knew someone who might. A man named Dimitri who worked at a truck stop 50 miles north of here. He'd been investigating this phenomenon for years. When I got to the truck stop, I found Dimitri working in the mechanic's bay. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with weathered skin and intense gray eyes. The moment I told him my story, he nodded like he'd heard it 1,000 times before. He took me to a room behind the garage and showed me a wall covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes. This was his investigation. 17 years of tracking disappearances, strange phenomena, and impossible events centered around truckers. He'd organized it by route, by location, by the type of entity or anomaly encountered. It was like looking at a conspiracy board in a detective's office. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. Dimitri told me that highways in America held secrets. Some roads had been built over places of power, ancient places. Native American burial grounds, occult ritual sites, dimensional weak points where reality itself was fragile, and trucks with their massive engines and constant vibration somehow acted as keys to accessing these places. Dimitri explained that truckers were being hunted because we were witnesses. We traveled the roads at night when the barrier between worlds was thin. We passed through places where reality was negotiable, and certain entities had learned that truckers could be manipulated, could be lured, could be collected. He showed me a map of the United States marked with red pins. Each pin represented a location where a trucker had vanished or experienced a supernatural encounter. When I looked at the distribution, a pattern emerged. The pins weren't random. They formed lines, specific routes that connected major cities but also connected to something else. Dimitri said they formed a pattern that resembled some kind of ancient symbol. A sigil, maybe. He told me about the warehouse I'd seen. It wasn't actually in the desert. It existed in a pocket dimension, a fold in space that was anchored to that location. Truckers had been disappearing there for decades, entire crews vanishing without a trace. Their trucks were being collected for a reason. They were being gathered for something. When I asked what that reason was, Dimitri's expression darkened. He said he didn't know, but he suspected it was preparation, like someone or something was collecting trucks for a specific purpose, a plan that would eventually come to fruition. And when it did, there would be nothing normal about it. He told me I had a choice. I could stop driving and try to live a normal life. But Dimitri said I'd never be safe. I'd been marked by my encounter with Petra. I'd been inside the warehouse. I was connected to their network now. The best I could do was stay vigilant, learn the warning signs, help other truckers avoid the same fate. And if I wanted answers, Dimitri said I needed to contact a woman named Elena. She was a former trucker who'd been investigating this phenomenon longer than anyone. She might have answers that could help me understand what was really happening out there on the roads. I stayed at Dimitri's truck stop for 3 days while he helped me contact Elena. She lived in a small town outside of Denver and worked as a consultant for the trucking industry. When she finally agreed to meet me, there was something in her voice that suggested she'd been expecting my call. Like she'd known I would eventually find my way to her. Elena was maybe 60 years old when I met her, with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't comprehend. She'd been driving trucks since 1984. She'd had her own encounters with the impossible, her own brush with the entities that haunted America's highways. She told me about the hitchhiker phenomenon. Said it had been happening for at least 70 years that she could document. Drivers reported picking up passengers who had vanished from locked cabs or melted away at specific mile markers. The pattern was consistent. The stories were always similar, only the details changed. Elena had a theory. She believed the hitchhikers were scouts. They were being used to identify receptive drivers, people like me who would stop to help a stranger in need, people whose kindness made them vulnerable to manipulation. The hitchhikers would report back to whatever force controlled them, and then the real hunting would begin. She showed me her own documentation, years of research compiled from trucker forums, missing persons reports, and interviews with drivers who'd experienced supernatural phenomena. The data was overwhelming. Hundreds of incidents, patterns that repeated across the country, geographic clusters that suggested deliberate activity. When I asked her what we could do, Elena said the only option was to warn other truckers, share the knowledge we'd accumulated, create networks of drivers who understood what was really happening out there, And most importantly, never drive alone if you could avoid it. Travel in convoys. Stay in contact with other drivers, because whatever was collecting trucks and hunters for things that went bump in the night, it preferred isolated targets. Elena had already started something she called the Truckers Warning Network. It was a private radio frequency that drivers used to alert each other to suspicious activity, phantom hitchhikers, and impossible locations. Over the next week, she taught me the protocols, how to recognize the signs, how to communicate with other drivers who understood the reality of what we were dealing with. Through the network, I learned that my experience wasn't unique. There were drivers all over the country who'd encountered similar things. A woman named Margot who'd been chased by a truck that seemed to have a will of its own. A man named Stefan who delivered cargo to a facility that existed in temporal flux where he'd lost an entire month in what felt like an afternoon. Each story was different but followed similar patterns. All of them involved truckers going to places they shouldn't go or picking up hitchhikers who weren't human. All of them left marks, psychological wounds that never fully healed, a kind of contamination that made you forever aware of how thin the veil was between our reality and something else. Elena explained that the entities hunting truckers operated on a logic we couldn't fully comprehend. They didn't follow human rules or morality. They existed in the spaces between roads, in the shadows cast by highway lights, in the moments between sleeping and waking during long hauls. She said that the warehouse I'd found wasn't the only one. There were other collection points across the country, other places where trucks were being gathered for purposes we could only speculate about. The thought of it made me sick. How many drivers were lost out there? How many families would never know what happened to their loved ones? Elena told me that she suspected something big was coming. The intensity of the activity had been increasing over the past 5 years. More sightings, more disappearances, more reports of impossible phenomena. It felt like whatever was happening was reaching some kind of crescendo. Like everything was building towards something catastrophic. Over the next 6 months, I coordinated with Elena and the Truckers Warning Network to compile data on all the phenomena we could document. We created databases, we mapped locations, we analyzed patterns, and what emerged was terrifying. The activity was accelerating exponentially. The number of reported incidents was doubling every few weeks. Drivers were experiencing increasingly aggressive encounters with entities that seemed to have purpose and intent. A hitchhiker in Arizona that tried to forcibly take control of a truck, a warehouse in Nevada that was actually visible on multiple witnesses' dash cam footage before vanishing from existence. A stretch of highway in Louisiana where entire convoys were disappearing without a trace. But more disturbing than the increase in incidents was the change in the entities seemed to be communicating with each other, coordinating their activities. It was like they were building towards something specific, a convergence event. Elena theorized that they were gathering trucks and drivers because they needed them for something, a plan that was reaching its culmination. I received a call from Dimitri at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. His voice was urgent, terrified. He told me he'd cracked something. He'd been analyzing the pattern of disappearances, and he'd realized they formed a shape, a geometric pattern that covered major portions of the country. When you drew lines connecting all the disappearance sites, you got a shape that resembled some kind of ritualistic diagram, and the pattern was almost complete. There were only a few critical gaps left, a few more locations where the network needed to be filled in, and according to Dimitri's calculations, those gaps would be filled within the next 2 weeks. When they were, the pattern would be complete, and Dimitri believed that was when whatever this was would activate. When I asked him what would happen then, Dimitri went silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know, Marcus, but I know it's not going to be good." Elena called an emergency meeting of the Warning Network. Every trucker who could make it gathered at a truck stop near Oklahoma City. There were maybe 40 of us. All of them had experienced something. All of them carried the marks of having crossed over into places they shouldn't have. We spent all night analyzing Dimitri's data, looking at the pattern, trying to figure out what it meant and how to stop it. Someone noticed something crucial. The gaps in the pattern didn't just form a geometric shape. They aligned with specific highways, specific routes that connected major population centers. When the pattern was complete, it would create a kind of network, a web that spanned the entire continental United States. Elena theorized that the web would act as a conduit, a way to channel energy or entities into our reality on a massive scale. Whatever it was, it would be powerful enough to affect millions of people. We knew we had to stop it. But the question was how? We couldn't exactly call the authorities and tell them that supernatural beings were using truck routes to create a portal into our world. We'd all end up in psychiatric institutions. Elena said we had one option. We had to complete the pattern ourselves. Drive the missing routes. deliberately go to the locations that would fill the gaps in the geometric diagram. But instead of allowing ourselves to be collected, we would fight back. We would disrupt the pattern from within. It was suicide mission. We all knew it. But we also knew that if we didn't try, something catastrophic was going to happen. Millions of people in major cities would be affected by whatever emerged when the pattern was complete. We couldn't let that happen. 17 of us volunteered to make the final runs, to drive the last routes that would complete the geometric pattern. Elena said we should do it simultaneously, all at the same time, the night of the new moon, when the barrier between worlds would be at its thinnest. The night of the new moon arrived. I was assigned to drive a route through West Texas, a stretch of highway between two small towns that supposedly led to one of the collection points. I was given a specific time to be at a specific location, midnight exactly. 16 other drivers were simultaneously on their routes, all heading to their designated locations. We were all connected via the private network. Elena was coordinating from the truck stop in Oklahoma, monitoring our positions and communications. As midnight approached, the static on the radio became almost deafening. Then I saw it. The warehouse, just like the one I'd encountered before, except larger, much larger. It rose out of the desert like a massive malignant thing. But this time I wasn't alone. Through my radio, I could hear the other drivers. They were seeing similar structures, 17 warehouses appearing simultaneously across the country, and they were connected. Through some mechanism I couldn't understand, they were all connected to each other through the highways themselves. The trucks moving along the routes were part of the network. We were the conduits. We were the blood cells in a massive organism that was spreading across the country. That's when Elena's voice came through the radio. She told us all to accelerate, to drive directly toward the warehouses at maximum speed. She said the pattern was trying to solidify. We had to disrupt it by breaking the connections, by crashing into the network nodes before it could fully activate. I slammed my accelerator to the floor. My truck roared as I drove directly toward the warehouse. Behind me, I could see manifestations forming in my mirrors, shapes that weren't quite solid, beings made of shadow and static that were trying to prevent me from reaching the warehouse, but I was moving too fast. I crashed directly into the warehouse's exterior wall at almost 90 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. My cab crumpled like paper. I should have been killed instantly, but something protected me. Some kind of force pushed back against the collision, cushioning the impact just enough for me to survive. I blacked out. When I came to, everything was different. The warehouse was collapsing, not physically, dimensionally. It was folding in on itself. Through my shattered windshield, I could see the other 17 warehouse locations doing the same thing. All across the country, the collection points were imploding. The geometric pattern was shattering. The network was breaking down. Through the radio, I could hear the other drivers reporting in. Some of their messages were garbled, some ended abruptly, but enough of them confirmed that the plan had worked. We'd disrupted the pattern, we'd broken the connections, the network was dying, but the entities it had been designed to channel were furious. I could feel them thrashing against the dimensional barriers. The space around me began to crack and warp. The desert floor was literally splitting open. Fissures were appearing and closing, revealing glimpses of other places. Other times, other dimensions stacked on top of ours like pages in a book. Then I heard Elena's voice one more time. She told me to get out of the cab, to run toward the fissures. She said that by disrupting the network, we created openings, temporary passages to places outside the normal structure of reality. If I could reach one of those passages before they closed, I could escape. I crawled out of my truck and ran. Behind me, the warehouse was completely gone now, dissolved like it had never existed, but the entities were still there. I could feel them, sense them. They were reaching for me with appendages made of pure rage and anguish. I threw myself into one of the fissures just as it was closing. For a moment, I felt like I was falling through impossible geometry. Then, everything went black. I woke up in a hospital in El Paso. According to the doctors, a truck had crashed into a canyon wall in West Texas. The driver had somehow survived with minimal injuries. That was me. But when they asked me what happened, I couldn't explain it, so I lied. Said I'd fallen asleep at the wheel. Simple as that. They kept me for observation, 2 days of tests and evaluations. During that time, I received visits from Elena, Dimitri, and a few others from the network. We didn't talk about what happened, not directly, but through careful language and careful timing, we understood each other. Of the 17 drivers who'd made the final runs that night, 15 survived. 2 of them vanished completely. We don't know what happened to them. Maybe they made it through to somewhere else. Maybe they're still trapped in the spaces between. We may never know. but the phenomenon stopped. After that night, reported incidents of supernatural activity on American highways dropped to almost zero. The hitchhikers stopped appearing. The phantom destinations vanished. The collection points were shut down. Whatever had been gathering trucks and drivers for its cosmic ritual was disrupted beyond repair. I've been driving for 6 more years since that night, but I'm not the same person I was before. None of us are. We carry the knowledge of what's really out there. The understanding that reality is far more fragile than most people realize. That highways hold secrets. That the darkness between towns is full of things that defy rational explanation. Elena still runs the warning network. Dimitri still maintains his investigation. And I still drive! Because someone has to be out there on those roads at night watching for signs, making sure that whatever tried to use us doesn't try again, making sure no other driver stumbles into a nightmare they can't escape. Every time I pass mile marker 187 on I-80, I think of Petra. I think of that cold touch and those empty black eyes. And I'm grateful. Grateful that I survived. Grateful that we stopped it before it was too late. And terrified of what might have happened if we hadn't.